Hey Planeswalkers, what do you hear, what do you say? This is Eric again from Bane Alley Magic, bringing you another Commander deck tech video. Today I'm going to be sharing another deck list I've made from a legend spoiled from the up-and-coming Ravnica Allegiance set. This time it's Nikya of the Old Ways. But before I do, I'd just like to remind you to please hit that like button or maybe even that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. So, Nikya is a 5/5 Centaur Druid for 3, a red and a green, and she says you can't cast non-creature spells. And whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. So all of your lands are going to add an extra mana of whatever land they produced. And she says, the hooves of the raise boar will trample the weak and their city to dust. So, what I love about Nikya, first off, is the artwork. I mean, I know the high definition image has not been released yet, but you can already tell that she looks epic. Her mohawk is excellent, and just look at that staff. The image is really dynamic, not only in the pose, but in the color play and the contrast as well. I like how the background goes from red to misty to green with that hidden Gruul sigil, and the detail is just off the hook with the little bones everywhere and the glowing skull. So overall, kudos to Ryan Pancoast for making some great artwork. So back to the card mechanics. Obviously, the big downside is that we can't cast non-creature spells. And when it comes to instants and sorceries, there is really no way around that, even if you suspend the spell or somehow get to play it without paying its mana cost. There are cards that allow you to cheat out non-creature permanents, but those cards are normally not even creatures themselves, so they don't really fit in this deck. This deck is all about creatures. In fact, it runs a total of 51 creatures, not including Nikya herself. Even though the deck primarily focuses on creatures, it still has many many ways to ramp and ways to draw cards and destroy our opponent's creatures. Now, there are many ways you could go about building this deck, and I found that going Dragon Tribal would be an interesting strategy, as dragons, need ramp, and Nikya helps with that, and dragons also have a great toolbox of creatures. In other words, they have a large selection of creatures with a wide variety of powerful abilities. I decided to go with the good Gruul stuff, stompy route. This deck is all aggro all the way, and I know what you're going to say. Aggro is not a powerful strategy in Commander, but the upside to Nikya gets around that. The ability to double the mana our lands produce is huge in Commander. I can't tell you how many games I've seen where the person who ramped the most ended up winning, or how many games I've won because I ramped the most. Experienced Commander players will tell you it stinks only being able to play 1 spell a turn. But if you ramp early in the game, you can eventually cast multiple large spells in a single turn and take over the game really quickly, especially when you combine your ramp with card draw, which this deck also has a lot of. Now, there is actually one way for non-creature spells to get around Nikya's downside, and that is cycling. If we have Nikya on the battlefield and we draw a non-creature spell with cycling, we can just cycle it away and draw a different card. Some cards actually have an extra bonus when you cycle them, and one of those cards is in the deck, and no, it's not Decree of Annulation. Another way we can get around the downside of not being able to cast non-creature spells is to play lands with useful abilities instead. Because we are only playing a 2-color deck, we have room to put a wide variety of lands to help us in different situations. But let's start with the creatures, and we have lots of creatures that are going to help us ramp. And if you know me and you've seen my last several videos, I don't really like, creature ramp normally. I like artifact ramp. I like ramp that's going to stick around on the battlefield. So, there's no, Lana War elves in here. The only creatures I have in here that ramp are going to be creatures that actually get us a land onto the battlefield, because that's something that's going to stick around, whereas if you have Lana War elves, or Birds of Paradise, when those are dead, they're just dead. So all of these are going to be creatures, for the most part, except for Grand Warlord Rada, are going to be creatures that can get us a land, an extra land, and that's what's really important. So Farhaven Elf is 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Druid, and when Farhaven Elf enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. Next we have Sakura Tribe Elder, also known as Steve, a 1/1 Snake Shaman for 1 and a green, and you can sacrifice Steve to search your library for a basic land card and put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. This card is used in a lot of modern decks to ramp because it's just, a body that can get you a land card on the battlefield tap for just 2 mana, and you can block with it, and in response to damage, sacrifice it and search for the land at the same time as preventing the combat damage that would be dealt to you. So never underestimate a card that has a nickname. Next we have Dawn Treader Elk, 1 and a green for a 2/2 Elk. It's very similar to Steve, except you just got to pay 1 mana to do the ability. So for 1 green, you sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So not a bad card, it just, costs 1 more mana than Steve does. Next we have Grand Warlord Rada, 2, a red and a green for a 3/4 Elf Warrior with haste. So this probably wouldn't be in the deck if it didn't have haste. So thankfully, since it has haste, we can use Rada's ability right away. So whenever 1 or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of green or red to your mana pool. And until the end of the turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, because normally as soon as a phase ends, all your mana ends. Apparently as soon as a step ends as well, all your mana is drained from your mana pool. So this will last for the whole rest of your turn. And haste is just great. It's like an extra combat step. You get to use her right away. So she's guaranteed to get you some mana, whereas, again, Llanowar Elves might not even make it 1 round around the table to produce you that 1 green mana. Next we have Nissa Vastwood Seer, 2 generic and a green for a 2/2 legendary Elf Scout. And when Nissa Vastwood Seer enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, you exile Nissa and then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control, and she becomes our 1 Planeswalker in the deck. Yeah, so it's a Planeswalker, which we can cast because it starts as a creature. So she starts with 3 loyalty counters. You can +1 to reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. -2, you put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashia, the Awoken World, onto the battlefield. And for -7, you untap up to 6 target lands, and they become 6/6 elemental creatures, and they're still lands. Just be aware that when your lands become creatures, they're susceptible to board wipes, and you might be losing your lands there. But for the most part, she's just here to ramp us up a ton. She ramps us when she enters the battlefield, at least getting us a land to our hand, not on the battlefield, but to our hand still helps a bit. And yeah, but her +1 ability is going to ramp us up as well. Just getting us extra lands onto the battlefield is huge, especially with Nikya, who's going to be doubling all of these lands mana that they're producing. Next we have Courser of Crufix, 1 a green and a green for a 2/4 Centaur. You play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play the top card of your library if it's a land, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So pretty sweet. You get extra land out of it. So if you have the land on top of your library, play that instead of a land from your hand, is usually what you're going to do, so you could just dig deeper through your deck. Next we have Mina and Den Wildborn, 2 and a red and a green for a 4/4 Elf Ally. And whenever you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Pretty useful. And you can pay a green and a red and return a land you control to its owner's hand to give target creature trample until the end of the turn. So what's great about this is you can, return the land you played for the turn to your hand to give a creature trample and then play it again, because you're allowed to play an additional land on each of your turns. Next we have Wayward Swordtooth, a 5/5 dinosaur for a 2 and a green, which has Ascend. If you control 10 or more permanents, either when you cast the spell or at any point when this permanent is on the battlefield, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and Wayward Swordtooth can't attack or block unless you have the City's Blessing, which in Commander it's really easy to get because we're playing a late game format. We're a format that's based around the late game, so I've almost never had Wayward Swordtooth not be able to attack or block, but I'm sure it's happened to someone. Next, we have Oracle of Muldaya, 3 and a green for a 2/2 elf shaman, which says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. You play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play the top card of your library if it's a land. Similar to Courser of Crufix, except a little better. Next, we have Solemn Simulacrum, 4 for an artifact creature golem, which is a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. And when Solemn Simulacrum dies, you may draw a card. So, normally I don't include Solemn or Burnished Heart in green decks, but this is the exception because, we need that creature stuff. We don't have our powerful green non-creature ramp spells, so I think Solemn and Burnished Heart are some of the more powerful creature-based ramp and card draw in the game as far as Solemn goes. So, excellent choice, I think. And then next we got Burnished Heart, which is 3 generic for an artifact creature elk, and it's a 2/2, and you can pay 3 mana to sacrifice it and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So this is, a total of 6 mana to get 2 lands on the battlefield, but you also have, the ability to have a nice little 2/2 blocker, and you can respond again to damage by sacrificing it. Same with Yavimaya Elder, a 2/1 human druid, and it's 1 and a green, and when the Elder dies, you may search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. And you can also pay 2 mana to sacrifice Yavimaya Elder to draw a card. So, just like Solemn, Yavimaya Elder is both going to be drawing us a card and getting us lands onto the battlefield. So, pretty excellent. Alright, continuing. Next we have our card draw creatures, which we have about 12. Dismissive Pyromancer is the cheapest for 1 and a red for a 2/2 human wizard from M19. Pretty new card. You can pay a red and tap it to discard a card and then draw a card. You can pay 2 and a red to tap it, and you sacrifice it to have it deal 4 damage to target creature, so also acts as a little bit of removal. Next we have Magus of the Wheel, a 3/3 human wizard for 2 and a red, and you can pay 1 and a red and tap it and sacrifice it to have each player discard their hand and then draw 7 cards. Yeah, sometimes that's really useful. It can also really ruin your opponents. Somebody's always mad about it. They're like, I don't want to discard my hand. But this is obviously best when you play this as you have no cards in your hand, and then you're just basically drawing 7 cards for that 2 mana. Next we have Mad Prophet, 3 and a red for a 2/2 human shaman with haste. You can tap it to discard a card and draw a card. I actually put this in quite a few decks. It's just, a decent card draw ability on a body that has haste, so we can use it right away. It's pretty sweet. Next we have Ripjaw Raptor, 2 and 2 green for a 4/5 dinosaur, which has Enrage, so whenever it's dealt damage, you draw a card. Next we have Beast Whisperer, 2 and 2 green for a 2/3 elf druid. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. And hopefully that card's going to be another creature, which you're going to be able to cast again and draw another card and then cast another creature. It gets really out of control when you have, Beast Whisperer and Nikya of the Old Ways out. You basically have the card Zendikar Resurgent, which we don't have in this deck because it's not a creature, but it's a really great card. Next we have Garrick's Pack Leader, 4 and a green for a 4/4 beast. Whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you get to draw a card. And there's quite a bit of creatures with power 3 or greater in this deck, including our commander, so that's pretty sweet. Next we have Itali Primal Storm, 4 and 2 red for a 6/6 Elder Dinosaur. Whenever she attacks, you exile the top card of each player's library, and then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Unfortunately, if Nikya is out, you can only cast creatures. But if Nikya is not out, you get to cast any of them, so pretty sweet. Also ends up being a target, so, sometimes it won't last, but we got a couple ways to protect her. Next we have Combustible Gear Hulk, 4 and 2 red for a 6/6 artifact creature construct with first strike, and when Combustible Gear Hulk enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards, but if that player doesn't, then you put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then Combustible Gear Hulk deals damage to that player equal to the total converted mana cost of those cards. So that can be really huge, especially in a game of Commander. I mean, imagine if you just revealed the next 3 cards I'm going to talk about. That would be so much damage you deal that person. Sometimes you only reveal 3 lands, but whatever. Oftentimes they're going to let you draw 3 cards, so pretty sweet card. Next we have Soul of the Harvest. 4 and 2 green for a 6/6 elemental with trample, and whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. And again, we have 51 creatures in this deck, so once you get Soul of the Harvest out, you are going to be drawing some cards, as long as it survives. Next we have Regal Force, 4 and 3 green for a 5/5 elemental, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each green creature you control, which is going to be at least 1 if it's just Regal Force, but hopefully you're going to have several green creatures out and drawing some cards off of this. Next we have Kozilek, the Great Distortion. Yeah, pure evil, I know, but I had to put it in this deck. It's great, you know. We got enough ramp in the deck that we're going to be able to cast Kozilek. We have plenty of colorless sources, so we are going to be able to play for that colorless cost. So Kozilek is a 12/12 legendary Eldrazi for 8 and 2 diamond, which means 2 of the 10 mana here has to come from a colorless source. And when you cast Kozilek, the Great Distortion, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. So if you have Kozilek and 3 other cards in your hand, you cast Kozilek and then you're going to draw 4 cards. Kozilek also has Menace, and you can discard a card with converted mana cost X to counter target spell with converted mana cost X. This is, for me, one of the most important abilities on the card, and one that most people forget about Kozilek, is that you can use any of the cards in your hand to counter a spell as long as it has the same converted mana cost. I mean, you could use a land, discard a land to counter Pact of Negation, So, pretty sweet. I love Kozilek, and I definitely don't mind discarding cards to counter spells that are going to ruin my day. Next, we have the other Kozilek Butcher of Truth, 10 mana for a 12/12 Eldrazi, and when you cast this Kozilek, you draw 4 cards, and it has Annihilator 4. So whenever this creature attacks, the defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. Yeah, not going to make you many friends, but can definitely win you the game. And when Kozilek Butcher of Truth is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. So really helpful against mill as well. If somebody mills this into your graveyard, you get to shuffle your whole graveyard back into your library. Or you could just discard it to shuffle your graveyard back into your library, or sacrifice it somehow. You put this guy in your graveyard goes back in your library, which is really useful. Next, we have our removal creatures, starting with Walking Ballista, which is an artifact creature construct, which is a 0/0 for X and X, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 4 to remove a +1/+1 counter from it. You can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter from Walking Ballista to have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So this is, if you got the mana, which with Nikya, you're going to have plenty of mana, you can pump Walking Ballista up really big and just ping off all of your opponent's tiny creatures. A really scary card. Next we have Jaya Ballard, Task Mage. For 1, a red and a red, you get a 2/2 human spell shaper, and she has 3 abilities. So you can pay a red and tap her, discard a card to destroy target blue permanent. Yeah, any blue permanent destroyed. Next, you can pay 1 and a red and tap her to discard a card, and Jaya Ballard Task Mage deals 3 damage to target creature or player. A creature dealt damage this way can't be regenerated this turn. And finally, you can pay 5, a red and a red, and tap her to discard a card, and Jaya Ballard deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. So, yeah, Jaya Ballard is a nice little board wipe, and it's no wonder that they made her into a Planeswalker, because she's kind of like a Planeswalker already as her old card. Next, we have Ulasht the Hate Steed, 2 a red and a green for a 0/0 Hydra. And when it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it for each other red creature you control, and a +1/+1 counter on it for each other green creature you control. And you can pay 1 mana and remove a +1/+1 counter on it, and it deals 1 damage to target creature, and or you put a 1/1 green sapperling creature token into play. So you get the choice. You either get to damage a creature, or you get to make a little army of 1/1 sapperling creature tokens. Mostly we're going to be using this to, ping off our opponent's creatures if necessary. Or, maybe it's just going to enter as a huge Hydra, deal lots of damage. That'd be cool. Next we have Daybreak Ranger. 2 and a green for a 2/2 human archer werewolf, and you can tap Daybreak Ranger to deal 2 damage to target creature with flying. At the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast this turn, you transform Daybreak Ranger, and it flips into Night Veil Predator, which is a 4/4 wolf. You can pay a red and tap Night Veil Predator to have it fight any target creature, so each deals damage equal to its power to the other. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, you transform it back into Daybreak Ranger. So there's actually a few werewolves in this deck, because they're good, and they're good utility creatures as far as removal goes, as you can see here. Next we have Huntmaster of the Fells, 2 a red and a green for a 2/2 human werewolf, and whenever this creature enters the battlefield or transforms into Huntmaster of the Fells, put a 2/2 green wolf creature token onto the battlefield, and you gain 2 life. At the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, you transform Huntmaster of the Fells into Ravager of the Fells, which is a 4/4 werewolf with trample. And whenever this creature transforms into Ravager of the Fells, it deals 2 damage to target opponent and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature that player controls. At the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, you transform Ravager of the Fells back into Huntmaster of the Fells, which is going to get you another wolf and gain you 2 more life. What's great about Huntmaster is it just keeps gaining you life, keeps dealing damage, keeps getting you little tokens. It's a nice little package all in one card. Super cool. Next, we have Volcano Hellion, 2 and 2 red for a 6/5, which Volcano Hellion has Echo X, where X is your life total. So basically, Volcano Hellion is not going to last the next turn. You have to pay X mana where X is your life total, or you have to sacrifice Volcano Hellion on the turn after you cast it. So pretty much we're always going to sacrifice it. But the important thing is, when it enters the battlefield, it deals an amount of damage of your choice to you and target creature. That damage can't be prevented. So you can basically choose an amount of damage, 20. It's also going to deal that damage to you, but you can deal any amount of damage you want to any target creature. So it's basically a great removal spell for any problematic creature that isn't indestructible. Also, what's great is if you can somehow give Volcano Hellion lifelink, you can just gain infinite life. You choose a number of your choice, and you gain that much life. It's a pretty amazing card. Next, we have Sunder Shaman, 5/5 giant shaman for 2 red and 2 green, and Sunder Shaman can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, and whenever Sunder Shaman deals combat damage to a player, destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls. Yeah, sweet removal spell for those nasty artifacts or enchantments. Next we have Pelucranos World Eater, a 5/5 Hydra for 2 and 2 green. I really love that this is actually in a deck. I've been looking for a home for it, and this is a great home for it because we can ramp so much. So Pelucranos has Monstrosity X, so you have to pay X twice and a green. And if this creature isn't monstrous, you put X +1/+1 counters on it, and it becomes monstrous. And when Pelucranos World Eater becomes monstrous, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures your opponents control. Each of those creatures deals damage equal to its power to Pelucranos. So you get to have Pelucranos fight a bunch of creatures and kill them. This is a nice little board wipe if you have plenty of mana to pump into it. Next we have Vyashno Heretic, 2 and a red for a 1/3 Vyashno, and you can pay 1 and a red and tap it to destroy target artifact, and Vyashno Heretic deals to that artifact's controller damage equal to the artifact's total casting cost. So if you destroyed their Thran Dynamo, for example, you're going to be dealing 4 damage to that Thran Dynamo's controller. Pretty sweet removal card. Let me just grab a drink of water here real quick. Lots of talking to do. Okay. So, yeah, I really like Vyashno Heretic as a removal spell, and thankfully now we're going to have plenty of mana to activate its ability. Just, again, you can see here why having that extra mana from the commander is really useful. Just doubling all of our mana lets us activate these abilities and cast multiple of these spells, do really cool things. So next, for our next werewolf, we have Ulrich of the Crawlin Horde. 3, a red and a green for a 4/4 human werewolf, and whenever this creature enters the battlefield or transforms into Ulrich, target creature gets +4/+4 until the end of the turn. At the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, you transform it into Ulrich Uncontested Alpha, a legendary werewolf, 6/6, and whenever this creature transforms into Ulrich Uncontested Alpha, you may have it fight target non-werewolf creature you don't control. So you get to have it fight someone else's creature. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, you transform it into Ulrich Uncontested Alpha. And then again, it's going to give another creature +4/+4. So just like Huntmaster of the Fells, this does really cool things when it flips into either side of its card. So pretty sweet. Next, we have Demanding Dragon, 3 and 2 red for a 5/5 flying dragon, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to target opponent unless that player sacrifices a creature. Yeah, so a tough choice. Next, we have 4 more creatures. I believe this is the... Oh, no, we do have some other creatures beside this. All right, so this is the end of our removal creatures anyway. We have Glorybringer, 3 and 2 red for a 4/4 dragon with flying and haste, and you may exert Glorybringer as it attacks. When you do, it deals 4 damage to target non-dragon creature an opponent controls. An exerted creature won't untap during your next untap step. I'm just going to go ahead and try to read a little slower. Next, we have Flame Blast Dragon, 4 and 2 red for a 5/5 dragon with flying. Whenever Flame Blast Dragon attacks, you may pay X in a red. If you do, the Flame Blast Dragon deals X damage to any target. Yeah, Planeswalker, creature, player, artifact, what have you. Next, we have Balefire Dragon, 5 and 2 red for a 6/6 dragon with flying. When Balefire Dragon deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. Yeah, pretty sweet one-sided board wipe on a dragon. Next we have Borborygmos, enraged Borborygmos. Yeah, I like to pronounce things correctly. That's how you say it. Borborygmos, Borborygmos enraged. 4, 2 red and 2 green, that's right, 8 mana for a 7/6 legendary Cyclops with trample. And whenever Borborygmos Enraged deals combat damage to a player, reveal the top 3 cards of your library, put all land cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, and you can discard a land card to have Borborygmos Enraged deal 3 damage to target creature or player. So we're going to be discarding lands to remove our opponent's annoying creatures. Most of the time, though, this might just more be of a ramp card to get us those lands that we need. And next, on to some utility creatures. We got Hope of Girapur, 1 mana for a legendary artifact creature Thopter, which is a 1/1 flyer, which can be your commander. And you can sacrifice Hope of Girapur, and until your next turn, target player who was dealt damage by Hope of Girapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells, so it prevents one of your opponents from casting non-creature spells until your next turn. Pretty sweet, only really works once in this deck because we don't have much graveyard recursion, but we do have Skullwinder, 2 and a green for a 1/3 snake with Death Touch, and when Skullwinder enters the battlefield, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, then choose an opponent. That player returns a card from his or her graveyard to his or her hand. Next we have Eternal Witness, 1 and 2 green for a 2/1 human shaman, and when Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Next we have Tana the Bloodsower, 2 a red and a green for a 2/2 elf druid with trample, and whenever Tana the Bloodsower deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green sapperling creature tokens. So nice little way to make tokens for the deck. Next we have Anger, 3 and a red for a 2/2 incarnation with haste, and as long as Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. So yeah, one of the better ways for giving your red creatures haste is Anger, definitely. Next we have a couple of gods. Nylea, God of the Hunt, 3 and a green for a 6/6 legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to green is less than 5, Nylea isn't a creature, so each green mana symbol in the mana cost of permanence you control counts toward your devotion to green. And Nylea says other creatures you control have trample, and you can pay 4 mana, 3 and a green, to give target creature +2/+2 until the end of the turn. So you can do that as many times as you want, and you can really pump up your creatures huge, especially with Nikya's mana doubling abilities, and hopefully get in that lethal damage. Next we have Perforos, God of the Forge, 3 and a red for a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, Perforos isn't a creature, it's just an enchantment. Though, by the way, while these spells are in your hand or in any other place other than the battlefield, they are considered to be creature spells. And Perforos also says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Perforos deals 2 damage to each opponent. And you can pay 2 and a red to give creatures you control +1/+0 until the end of the turn. So, such a powerful creature, one that's going to make the table probably turn on you, but we have ways to help against that. But definitely Perforos is a card that's going to end games, especially in a deck that's running so many creatures. It was only logical to put him in the deck. And just like Nylea, he can also pump up all of your creatures, and if you have both of these out, it's really powerful, giving all of your creatures trample and, extended power. It's just excellent. All right, and on to our final creatures. Next we have Ogre Battle Driver, 2 and 2 red for a 3/3 Ogre Warrior that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until the end of the turn. Yeah, let's just give our whole team haste. Sounds good. And +2/+0. Excellent. Next we have Xenagos, God of Revels, 3, a red and a green for a 6/5 enchantment god. And as long as your devotion to red and green is less than 7, Xenagos isn't a creature, but he is still an indestructible enchantment, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature you control gains haste and gets +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is that creature's power. So it makes your big creatures even bigger and very scary. Next we have Rurik Thar, the Unbowed, 4, a red and a green for a 6/6 Ogre Warrior with Vigilance and Reach, and Rurik Thar, the Unbound, attacks each combat of Fable, and whenever any player casts a non-creature spell, Rurik Thar deals 6 damage to that player. Really powerful. Also a great option for switching out as your commander if you're playing against someone who's playing like a Storm deck or someone who is playing a lot of non-creature spells. Rurik Thar actually punishes people for playing non-creature spells and can really end the game quickly against those types of decks. Next we have Avenger of Zendikar, 5 and 2 green for a 5/5 elemental. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. And it has landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a 1/1 counter on each plant creature you control. So even if you somehow control other plants as well, all of your plants get a +1/+1 counter whenever you play a land. So the big mistake people make is they play this after they play their land for turn. Remember, you want to play your land for turn after you play Avenger of Zendikar, so all of your plant tokens can immediately become 1/2s instead of being 0/1s for a whole turn. So hopefully you have 7 lands out as you're playing Avenger of Zendikar and you get at least 7 tokens. And so it's just a great little army in a can, definitely, and really synergizes well with Craterhoof Behemoth, a card that will end games, guaranteed. So Craterhoof Behemoth is 5 and 3 green, so that's 8 mana total for a 5/5 beast with haste. Gotta love the haste. And when Craterhoof Behemoth enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So if you control 8 creatures as you're casting Craterhoof Behemoth, well, he's going to make it 9 creatures, and all of your creatures are going to get +9/+9 and trample, and that is usually something that's going to end games, definitely, especially if you have a token deck or something like that. Alright, and now our deck can't be just full of all creatures, so we do have some non-creature spells. starting with Conqueror's Galleon. These are a couple of our non-creature draw card spells. So Conqueror's Galleon is 4 generic for a 2/10 vehicle, and when Conqueror's Galleon attacks, you exile it at the end of combat, and then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. And it has crew 4, so you tap any number of creatures you control with total power 4 or more, and this vehicle becomes an artifact creature until the end of the turn, so it can't actually attack until you crew 4. But as soon as it attacks, you exile it at the end of the combat, no matter what, and it becomes Conqueror's Foothold, a land that taps for 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 2 mana and tap it to draw a card, then discard a card. You can pay 4 mana and tap it to draw a card, or you can pay 6 mana and tap it to return any card from your graveyard to your hand. This is really sweet, actually, to have this land out and just having these options out there, especially in a deck that can't cast non-creature spells. Like I said, we have lots of lands that can help us get around that. But these, unfortunately, have to transform into lands first, so we have to cast these when Nikya isn't on the battlefield. Next, we have Vance's Blasting Cannons, 3 in a red for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast it this turn. And whenever you cast your 3rd spell in a turn, you may transform Vance's Blasting Cannons into Spitfire Bastion. So it's another land that can tap to add a red to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 in a red and tap it, and it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So another good utility land. We got the card draw with Conqueror's Foothold. We got the removal with Spitfire Bastion. Next, we have another transforming thing. We got lots of transforming cards. So if you build this deck, make sure your sleeves are not totally see-through. Next, we have Thematic Compass. 2 generic for an artifact. You can pay 3 mana and tap it to search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 7 or more lands, you transform Thematic Compass into Spires of Arazka, which is a land that taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can tap it to untap target attacking creature an opponent controls and remove it from combat. So you remove their most powerful attacking creature from attacking you and prevent all that damage. So really helpful in keeping you alive, and it ramps you up. Really cool card. I like Thematic Compass a lot. It is our only non-creature ramp spell in the deck. Next, we have our cycling spells. So we have 3 total spells that we can cycle in the deck. I suggest putting in as much as you want because, again, even if you can't play them, you can still cycle them. So Lull is 1 and a green for an instant. It says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Really helpful when it comes down to the end game and someone's about to kill you or you're about to kill them. It's just that last turn, who's it going to be? But if you have the fog, it's going to be you. Or you can cycle this away for 2, so you can pay 2 mana, discard this card, and draw a card. Next, we have one of the coolest cycling cards ever, Treacherous Terrain, for 6 and a red and a green, so 8 mana total. Hopefully you don't cycle this. Hopefully you get to cast it. Treacherous Terrain deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of lands that player controls. Oh my god. If you cast this on turn 8, that's 8 damage to each opponent. Hopefully, as long as no one's been missing their land drops. And if they have, well, they're behind anyway, so who cares? But, if you cast this way late, someone can have like 20 lands on the battlefield, This can be a lot of damage to your opponents. And this also has basic land cycling, so you can pay 2 mana, discard this card, and instead of drawing a card, with basic land cycling, you search your library for a basic land card and reveal it and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Next, we have Blasphemous Act, which is the start of our removal spells that are non-creature. So Blasphemous Act is 8 and a red for a sorcery. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, so you could potentially cast this for 1 red mana as long as there's 8 creatures on the battlefield. And Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature, so pretty much enough to kill any creature. Next, we have our last cycling sorcery, Slice and Dice. 4 and 2 red for a sorcery. Slice and Dice deals 4 damage to each creature, or you can cycle it for 2 and a red, and look at this. When you cycle Slice and Dice, you may have it deal 1 damage to each creature. So this is an example of a card where you still get an advantage when you cycle the card. So I think that's really cool with Nikya of the old ways. You know, you can't cast the spell, but you can still cycle it and have it deal 1 damage to each creature. So that's pretty sweet. Next we have Star of Extinction. 5 and 2 red for a sorcery. You get to destroy target land. Yeah, destroy any land. And Star of Extinction deals 20 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. So it gets rid of planeswalkers, gets rid of pretty much every creature out there ever, except for maybe a really big consuming aberration. Next, we have 3 spells that can protect our creatures. You know, I didn't put too many of them in here because I just didn't have room. And, you know, our deck can rebuild pretty easily because we have so many creatures. So, we have 1 copy of Lightning Greaves. Of course, we have 1 copy of everything, but I mean, you know, we have 1 Lightning Greaves. You know, we don't have the Swiftfoot Boots. So, 2 mana for an artifact equipment, which has equip 0. An equipped creature has haste and shroud, so it can protect our commander. Next, we have Glaring Spotlight. 1 mana for an artifact. Creatures your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities you control as long as they didn't have, as though they didn't have hexproof. So any of our opponent's creatures has hexproof, you know, we don't care. We can still zap them with our creatures, our dragons, you know, our activated abilities. We can target their creatures with no problem as long as we have Glaring Spotlight. And we can pay 3 mana and sacrifice Glaring Spotlight to give creatures we control hexproof until the end of the turn and unblockable this turn. So we can make all of our creatures unblockable and hexproof. That's pretty game ending right there. Next we have Eldrazi Monument, 5 mana for an artifact. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and have flying and have indestructible. Pretty excellent. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you have to sacrifice a creature. If you can't, you sacrifice Eldrazi Monument. Again, with this deck, we have lots of creatures, so getting creatures out to sacrifice isn't much of a problem. Next we have our lands. So in this deck, like I said, we have lots of utility lands because we're only playing 2 colors. We have plenty of room to put in a variety of lands to help us in different situations. So first we have some lands that are going to draw us cards. Mikokoro, Center of the Sea, is a legendary land that taps to add a colorless mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 and tap it to have each player draw a card. No one's going to mind that. That's not a land anyone's going to blow up. Next, we have Gyre Reach Sanitarium, a legendary land that taps to add a colorless, or we can pay 2 and tap it, and each player draws a card and then discards a card. Now, this one sometimes makes people mad because some people just don't want to discard anything. They just don't like making that choice, so it's fun to watch them squirm. But it's great for you, you know, obviously when you're doing this, you don't mind discarding something like a land, you know, to get another card. So, really great utility land to help you out when you need to draw a card. Next, we have Arc of Arazka, a land with Ascend, and you can tap it to add a color to your mana pool. To add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. Activate this ability only if you have the City's Blessing. So these last 3 lands, you might notice, are totally colorless. You could put these in any deck, literally any deck, even your mono white deck. If you need help drawing cards, put these in your deck. They're great lands. Next we have Reliquary Tower, which is a land you should get for literally any deck. It says you have no maximum hand size, and you can tap it to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. So yeah, whatever Jin Gataxius, we have no maximum hand size, so we don't have to discard anything. Next we have Scavenger Grounds, a desert, which is the first desert. We actually have quite a few deserts in here. You can tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 mana and tap it, sacrifice a desert, and exile all cards from all graveyards. So really helps out when someone else is playing a reanimation deck or something and you want to put a stop to it. Next we have Kessig Wolf Run, which is a land that taps to add 1 to your mana pool, or you can pay X, a red and a green, and tap it to give target creature X, +X+0, and trample until the end of the turn. So if you have enough mana, especially if you got Nikya out, you know, you got plenty of mana, you can just end people with Kessig Wolf Run. You know, you just give your commander +X+0 and trample, and you're going to be dealing them enough commander damage in no time. Next, we have Glacial Chasm, a land that says cumulative upkeep, pay 2 life. So on the on your upkeep after you play this, you have to pay 2 life or sacrifice it. On your upkeep after that, you have to pay 4 life or sacrifice it. On your upkeep after that, you have to pay 6 life or sacrifice it, and so on. And when Glacial Chasm comes into play, you have to sacrifice a land. And creatures you control can't attack. Yeah, that really sucks. But it also says prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. That's the really important thing here. You know, this is a card that will keep you alive when everyone's ganging up on you, which they probably will when you're playing an aggro deck like this. So, you know, paying 2 life, 4 life, 6 life, that's really nothing when you consider the amount of life you can lose when 3 people are ganging up on you. I mean, when all 3 players or other players are ganging up on you in Commander, you can lose 50 life in one turn. You can just die completely in one turn, no problem. So Glacial Chasm is a card that will save you. There are some downsides, so you want to time it. You know, it's a card you don't want to play right away. You want to save it for later on in the game. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're down to 20 life. That's a fine time to play Glacial Chasm, and you're going to get many turns of being able to build up your board state. And then just remember that your creatures can't attack. So on the turn that you're ready to attack and finish the game, you have to sacrifice Glacial Chasm so that you can attack. Next, we have Spinerock Knoll and Mosswort Bridge, which are the hideaway lands. So when Mosswort Bridge or Spinerock Knoll enters the battlefield, they enter tapped, and when they do, you look at the top 4 cards of your library and exile one of them face down, put the rest on the bottom of your library. Spinerock Knoll taps to add a red mana to your mana pool, and you can pay a red and tap it, and you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if an opponent was dealt 7 or more damage this turn. Mosswort Bridge taps to add a green mana to your mana pool. You can pay a green and tap it, and you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater. So both of these abilities are not going to be too hard for our deck to get to, you know, to deal 7 damage or to have total power 7 or greater or in the battlefield. Not very hard for our deck to do, so great little ways to cast an extra spell, have a little more card advantage. Next we have Hashep Oasis, which is another desert. Taps to add a colorless, or you can tap it and pay 1 life to add a green mana to your mana pool. And you can pay 1, a green, and tap it, sacrifice any desert. Target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of the turn. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery, which, you know, actually, I don't know if that is actually negated with Nikya of the old ways, because with Nikya, you can't cast sorceries, so maybe you're not able to do Hashep Oasis's ability if Nikya is on the battlefield, I'm just realizing, so I'll have to look into that. If so, then maybe I'll take this land out. Next we have Ramanap Ruins. Taps to add a colorless to your mana pool. You can tap it and pay 1 life to add a red to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and 2 red and sacrifice a desert, and Ramanap Ruins deals 2 damage to each opponent. Thankfully, you don't have to do this only anytime you could cast a sorcery, so this one is definitely staying in the deck. Next, we have a couple of cycling lands. Desert of the Fervent is a desert that enters tapped. It taps to add a red mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and a red and discard it from your hand to draw a card. So the cycling lands are really helpful when you're just mana flooded. You already have plenty of lands, and then you just draw another land. Well, thankfully, if it has cycling, you can just discard it to draw the next card. So we have several cycling lands. We got Desert of the Indomitable, a desert that enters tapped. It taps to add a green mana to your mana pool, or you can cycle it for 1 and a green. Forgotten Cave enters tapped. It taps to add a red mana to your mana pool, or you can cycle it away for 1 red. Then we got Tranquil Thicket, enters tapped, taps to add a green mana to your mana pool, or you can cycle it away for 1 green. Next we have Gruul Turf, which is our 1 bounce land. It enters the battlefield tapped. When Gruul Turf enters the battlefield, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand, but the upside is Gruul Turf taps to add both a red and a green mana to your mana pool. So this is a land that adds 2 mana to your mana pool. And when you play this, you know, just make sure the land that you're returning to your hand is a land that you've already used for mana, and a land that's going to re-enter the battlefield untapped. If a bounce land is in your opening hand, you don't want to keep that opening hand unless, you know, you're able to cast spells before you play the bounce land. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 8 cards in your hand after you bounce the land back to your hand, and then you're going to have to discard a card. But as long as that's not the case, the bounce lands are really great in Commander. You know, they end up being an extra extra land in the long game, and again, we're playing a long game format, so all that little extra mana ramp helps out a lot, actually. Next, we have Mossfire Valley, a land that is kind of like a signet, so you can pay 1 mana and tap it to add both a red and green mana to your mana pool. But remember, you have to pay 1 mana to do it, so it's not like this is a land that taps to add 2 mana. I mean, it is, but you have to pay 1 mana to do it. So this is basically just a mana fixing land. Again, it's just like a signet. Next, we have Wooded Foothills, a land that says you can tap it and pay 1 life, you sacrifice it, and you get to search your library for any mountain or forest card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So that mountain or forest does not have to enter tapped, and it does not have to be a basic mountain or forest. It can be one of our other mountain forest cards coming up soon. Next, we have Firelit Thicket, which is a land that taps to add a colorless, or you can pay a green and tap it to add either red-red, red-green, or green-green to your mana pool. Kind of confusing how it's worded. Just read it carefully and recognize that it's basically just fixing your mana. This isn't adding extra mana to your mana pool, but it's fixing your mana so that it can be whatever colors you need to cast the spell you need. Next, we have Game Trail, which is a land that says as it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a mountain or forest card from your hand. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped, and it taps to add a red or green to your mana pool. Next, we have Spire Garden from the Battle Bond set. It enters tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, which in Commander you always should, and it taps to add a red or green mana to your mana pool. Next, we have Stomping Ground, which is our mountain forest, so you can get this with the land that says search your library for a mountain or forest. Stomping Ground says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters tapped. Next, we have Temple of Abandon, which enters tapped, but when it enters the battlefield, you get to scry 1. So you look at the top card of your library, you may put that card on the bottom if you want, and it taps to add a red or green. And last of our non-basics, we have Rootbound Crag, which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest already, and it taps to add a red or a green mana to your mana pool. And that brings us to our basic lands. So we have a total of 6 mountains and 7 forests in the deck, making a total of 37 lands, but only 36 lands that actually tap for mana, because Glacial Chasm doesn't tap for mana. But also, as you saw, we have several other cards that turn into lands, so getting lands is not really a problem in this deck. We got 37 lands that enter the battlefield normally, a couple more that enter the battlefield in other ways, and as you see, we got plenty of ramp, plenty of draw, plenty of removal, so this is a really sweet deck. I can't wait to play it. So that's it. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. It really helps out a lot. So this is Eric from Bane Alley Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.